I would like to thank Simon and the organisers of the West Cork History Festival for the invitation to give this talk here today. It is a great honour. In 2013, I was carrying out research for my biography of Emmett Dalton at the Military Archives at Cahill Barracks when I came across letters to do with a disturbing event during the War of Independence that I had never heard about before. A middle-aged woman called Bridget Noble had been abducted by the IRA on a lonely road near her home in Ardgroom on the Beara Peninsula in West Cork and never seen again by her loved ones. Her husband was trying to find out what happened to her, hence the letters. At that time in 2013, very little had been published about her disappearance. I carried out a Google search and found only one result, but a most remarkable one. Bridget was commemorated on the website of the musician and composer Scully. He had learned of Mrs. Noble's fate from his grandmother, who came from the Beara Peninsula, and who was horrified at what had been done to her. He had written a piece of music to commemorate the missing woman and called it Mrs. Noble. Crucially, his grandmother had also recorded an interview with Scully's great-grandaunt, Eva O'Sullivan, who came from Bridget's home area of Reenavad, and who provided an account of the capture and ultimate fate of Bridget Noble as relayed to her by a man who was in the IRA. This tape, incidentally, was played during the History Festival in 2017 by historian Eve Morrison. As I inquired further into the story of Bridget Noble, I came to realise that Bridget has her own sad place in the history of the revolutionary period. She is one of only two women known for certain to have been disappeared by the IRA during the War of Independence. The total number of disappeared between 1920 and 1923 is estimated at more than 100. The other woman who was disappeared during the War of Independence was Mary Lindsay, an elderly Protestant widow who lived in the Coachford area of County Cork and who was also abducted in early 1921, put to death along with her chauffeur, James Clark, after she was accused of being an informer. There may have been other women in East Cork whose names have never come to light, but these reported disappearances have never been confirmed. I decided to inquire further into the story of Bridget Noble, and the result was a book published earlier this year and available through Amazon. I carried out research in archives in Ireland and the UK, and important information emerged, especially through research in the Irish military archives. I also made visits to the Beara Peninsula, and local people there shared their own information. I tried to follow in the footsteps of Bridget Noble in the final days of her life on what one might call her Via Dolorosa. So who was Bridget Noble? She was born Bridget Neal or O'Neill in a humble thatched cottage at Reenavad, Ardgroom in January 1876. The ruins are still there in the field. It was a Gaeltacht area at the time, and Bridget was a native Irish speaker. Anecdotal evidence suggests she was a simple, naive, unsophisticated person, but one with a feisty personality, prepared to stand up for herself. These two characteristics would combine to cause serious problems for her. She was perhaps unfortunate to be the youngest of the family. Her older siblings either died or emigrated, leaving her to look after elderly parents John and Mary Neal and a tiny family farm of only 4 or 5 acres. Her older sisters Dora and Martha emigrated to America in the 1890s. married, had families, and lived lives of modest prosperity. Maybe Bridget would have liked to have gone to America also, but circumstances dictated that she would stay in Renovad. In America, Bridget's niece, Mary Scully, became one of the first group of women to join the U.S. Naval Reserve in 1917, when the Navy first began accepting female recruits after America entered the Great War. The man who would marry Bridget, Alexander Noble, was a cooper by trade, and he came from Fraserburgh, Aberdeenshire, on the northeast coast of Scotland. He was a Presbyterian and came from a notable family of mariners. His father, grandfather, and great-grandfather were all shipmasters, going to sea in command of sailing ships. The sea had inflicted tragedy on his family. An uncle had been lost at sea with his young wife when their ship foundered off the coast of what is now Indonesia. Alexander's father, Alexander Simnoble, was also lost when his ship, shown here, the Acacia, foundered off Tasmania in 1904. Alexander and his younger brother Willie took on a safer but perhaps more mundane occupation. They became coopers, making airtight barrels for the fish curing industry. Coopers were among the elite of tradesmen. They had to serve a long apprenticeship and were well paid. Alexander had experienced other family tragedy. Within the space of a few years, he lost 3 siblings due to tuberculosis. Alexander also had difficulties in his private life. An older woman who worked as a domestic servant brought a paternity suit against him in Peterhead Sheriff Court in September 1903, and he was ordered to pay maintenance for a boy who had been born earlier that year. At some stage in the early 1900s, Alexander Noble started a new life in Beara. Local men fished for mackerel, and there was a strong demand for barrels for the flourishing fish curing industry. According to local information, Alexander came to work here at Palace Pier near Ardgroom. Bridget may have encountered him as she walked by the pier on her way to Ardgroom village. He may have seemed exotic as he came from a different ethno-religious background. The vast majority of young men in her district were Catholic, sons of local farmers. A romance developed and they married in the Catholic Church at Iries in February 1907. Alexander was 33 years of age, while Bridget was 31. The record of the marriage shows that Alexander's brother Willie, a 17-year-old apprentice cooper, was a witness at the ceremony. The newlyweds settled down in her parents' 3-room cottage. Alexander's earnings as a cooper must have greatly enhanced the Neil family's meagre finances. He also helped with the farm work, and local youngsters were amused by how, in a Scots accent, he would call out to the cow, whom he named Starry, as he drove her along the road for milking. Bridget's tendency to stand up for herself is illustrated by this court case in January 1915. She felt she was being intimidated by a neighbour, and she had the woman bound to the peace at Castletownbere Petty Sessions. The Anglo-Irish War, the War of Independence, started in early 1919, and the conflict quickly spread to Beara. The local unit, the Beara Battalion, was part of the Cork No. 3 Brigade of the IRA, which deployed the flying column led by Tom Barry, which took part in some notable engagements such as the Kilmichael and Crossbarry ambushes. In Beara, there was an attack on Allihies RIC station in February 1920, in which a policeman was fatally injured. Then in July there was an attack on Ballycravan Coast Guard Station near Iries to seize arms, and Liam O'Dwyer, a leading member of the Beara Battalion, shot dead 2 Coast Guards. There was another serious incident in Beara in 1920. On the 7th of May, 3 masked men came to the home of a farmer called William Lahan at Cleandra. He was hit in the legs by 2 blasts from a shotgun. He had taken an evicted farm, and the intention may have been to punish rather than kill him, but he died later in hospital. This killing would have a bearing on the story of Bridget Noble. Early 1921 was a difficult time for 45-year-old Bridget. Her husband had moved away to seek work in England. There was a rumour that amid rising political tension he had been forced out, but this could not be confirmed. Alexander would state later in a letter to Eamon de Valera that there was no work in Ireland and he had gone to England so that he could support Bridget. Bridget's mother was dead at this stage, and she was looking after her father, who was in his 80s. Bridget was seen making visits to the RIC barracks in Castletown Bear, now the Garda station. She was also apparently friendly with an RIC sergeant in the town. Was she passing on information to the police about the IRA, or was there an innocent explanation for the visits? One local person heard from his own family, who were neighbours of Mrs. Noble, that she would ask Crown forces when they came into the area if they knew anything about Alexander. There is a local theory that this may have been a reason for her visiting the police station. There may have been a breakdown in communications, and she may have been worried that something untoward had happened to Alexander. It is also possible that the RIC took advantage of her naivety to get information. In early 1921, the local IRA decided to punish Bridget Noble. There were some younger single women in Castletown Bear who were friendly with the police, and it is unclear why Bridget was singled out. According to an internal IRA report shown here that was drawn up by Liam O'Dwyer, after coming home from hospital, Mrs. Noble was bobbed by order of battalion. This meant that her hair was forcibly shorn, a punishment designed to humiliate the victim. It has also been alleged that she was beaten and kicked and her savings robbed, although these details cannot be confirmed. And then Mrs. Noble went down a very dangerous route. She decided to complain to the RIC. According to Liam O'Dwyer's report, she went into the police station in Castletown Bear and handed in a letter to the head constable, naming 7 of the men whom she accused of the punishment attack. One man was arrested on the 4th of March and got 6 months for the bobbing attack. British records only show that he was sentenced for breaches of martial law. IRA members questioned a young woman, Nora Sullivan, who said she accompanied Mrs. Noble to the police station and saw her handing in the letter. This admission may have sealed Mrs. Noble's fate. On the 4th of March, the local IRA moved against Mrs. Noble. On that day, Mrs. Noble left her home and walked to Ardgroom village. She visited the shop run by Mrs. Bridget McCarthy, where she often bought items on account. The shop was situated in the blue-painted house on the right of the photo. The accounts book for the shop has survived, and this is where Mrs. Noble's last transaction is recorded. She owed money to the shop, and she paid 13 shillings and 10 pence, leaving a balance of £3, 6 shillings and 9 pence. She would never get to clear the debt. The transactions in her account come to an abrupt end at this point. The account shows that she bought an unusual item, a woolen shawl, on the 2nd of March. A shawl can be used to cover the head, and one wonders if it was to hide her embarrassment following the forcible shearing of her hair. The next item on her agenda was to travel to Castletown Beara. The internal IRA report claimed that she had received a letter from the RIC head constable asking her to call to see him. If this is correct, it may have been in connection with her complaint about the bombing attack. According to Eva O'Sullivan's informant, Mrs. Noble often took a lift with the driver of a horse-drawn bread delivery car, and the IRA warned him not to give her a lift. The bread man told her to walk on and he would pick her up. Walking out the road from Ardgroom towards Castletown Beara, Mrs. Noble would have quickly left houses behind and entered an area of rugged countryside. Instead of the bread delivery man, it was members of the IRA who came along and picked her up. According to Eva O'Sullivan's IRA contact, Mrs. Noble was taken to this area of Ballycravan near Iries and kept bound and gagged in a shed close to the pier. Meanwhile, if the IRA needed extra confirmation that Bridget had talked to the police about the bombing attack, it would have come in the form of a story in the Irish Independent on the 5th of March, the day after her abduction. The story stated, Dublin Castle reports a raid on the house of a woman farmer in Castletown Beara district by 8 masked men who cut off her hair and carried away £35 in notes. The motive is alleged to be that she was suspected of having given information to the police. More detailed accounts of the punishment appeared in newspapers in England and Northern Ireland. This story in a Belfast newspaper also appeared on the 5th of March, and this story reports that the unnamed woman victim, quote, was in delicate health, having recently undergone an operation, unquote. It appears that the RIC in Castletown Beara sent details of the attack on Mrs. Noble to Dublin Castle, where officials obviously decided to publicise the incident in order to discredit the IRA. It is known that at a later stage in her captivity, Mrs. Noble was held in a farmhouse at Faivwee, in a secluded valley of great natural beauty at Kilcatherine. The ruins of the dwelling are still there. In old age, in the mid-1990s, a local woman recalled memories of her long life for a local history project. She told how at age 17 years, as a member of Cumann she attended Mrs. Noble, or Biddy as she called her, in the house. The girl seemed to like Biddy and was sorry for her. She was not convinced of Biddy's guilt. Biddy was frightened and wouldn't drink tea unless her minders drank it first. And then one evening the IRA took Biddy away. The girl was horrified to hear that they had put Biddy into a sack and thrown her alive into the sea to drown, and that people heard her screaming. Later, some men who happened to be in the IRA called to her home to inquire about buying a boat. She challenged them over what had been done to Biddy. They were shocked, adopted a threatening attitude, said nothing, and left without buying the boat. Her father was angry that she had challenged the IRA men and warned her to keep her mouth shut. The fate of Mrs. Noble would remain a sensitive issue in Beara. According to the internal IRA report compiled by Limo Dwyer, Mrs. Noble was tried on the 13th of March, admitted guilt on all the charges, and was sentenced to death. It seems likely that the trial took place here, in the farmhouse at Faivui, where she was held captive. The death sentence was in violation of the IRA's General Order No. 13 that effectively excluded women from the death penalty. Neither was there any consultation with general headquarters in Dublin as laid down by the order. The death sentence was carried out 2 days later on the 15th of March, according to O'Dwyer. Unfortunately, O'Dwyer, as commandant of the Beara battalion, did not always obey IRA orders or instructions. At the end of the Civil War, he failed to obey the ceasefire order called by IRA leader Frank Aiken and continued with attacks on Free State forces in July and August. I believe the main reason Mrs. Noble was sentenced to death was that she had complained to the RIC about the men she accused of carrying out the bombing attack. As mentioned, according to the IRA report, one man was arrested and got 6 months. Another man would be interned after her death. Mrs. Noble was particularly unfortunate in that she had gone up against the IRA in an area where the War of Independence was being fought with particular intensity. There were at least 2 other cases, one in County Meath and the other in County Galway, where men, apparently volunteers, were jailed for periods ranging from 6 months to a year following hair-cutting attacks on females, and there was no indication that any of the female victims or witnesses who gave evidence in court were later targeted as informers. The other main allegation was that the IRA heard from the RIC that Mrs. Noble had given the names of Liam O'Dwyer and Patsy Dan Crowley to the police and said that these were the men who shot the farmer William Lahan for land grabbing. In his report, O'Dwyer states that what resulted from this information that Mrs. Noble gave to the police was not too serious, as any of the murderers were not caught but were kept on the run. The district was constantly raided for them until the truce, he wrote. Patsy Dan Crowley was a very active IRA man, a close associate of Liam O'Dwyer, and was an officer of Ardgroom Company. What O'Dwyer failed to mention was that regardless of what Mrs. Noble may or may not have told the police, he himself could never have been a suspect for the Lahan killing, as he was a deportee in England when the shooting took place on the 7th of May 1920. He was one of a number of internees deported by the authorities to Wormwood Scrubs earlier that year. It is apparent from his own military service pension file that the reason he was on the run was not because of the Lahan shooting, but because he had taken part in the attack on Ballycravan Coast Guard Station on the 25th of July 1920. Patsy Dan Crowley also took part in the attack on the Coast Guard Station, and this could help explain how he was also on the run. Following a period of detention in the house in the valley at Faivui, Mrs. Noble was taken by donkey and cart further along the coast en route to the location where she would face death. As she was being taken down this boreen at Darrick Road towards the sea, she was in great distress and called out for a neighbour to save her. Passing the home of Jack O'Sullivan, she called out, "Save me, Jack, save me." It was dark early in the morning when Jack and his young son Den, aged 9, heard the chilling sound of the woman calling out for help. One of our captors knocked on the door to say, "Everything is all right." A modern equivalent might be, "Nothing to see here." The family would later learn that the woman calling out for help was Bridget Noble. The memory would stay with Den all his life. Bridget was taken down to the shore and taken further east along the coast by boat. It is believed that Mrs. Noble was taken ashore here at Cuas Pier and kept overnight in a nearby shed. There was a ruin of an old stone shed close by, it's photographed here, and one wonders if this is where she was held. Then she was taken on a further journey to another location. I found a record in the military archives giving the names of the volunteers who accompanied Mrs. Noble on this part of the journey from Cuas to Pauline in the northeast corner of the townland of Ardgroom inward. I will return to this later. At some stage a priest was brought to her to administer the rites of the church. Anecdotal evidence indicates it was the local parish priest, the Reverend Michael Daly. It is unclear if the RIC carried out a search for Mrs. Noble. In West Cork, the force was under extreme pressure at this stage. I could find only one fleeting reference to her kidnapping in RIC records. In a report dated the 4th of May 1921, the RIC County Inspector for Cork West Riding, G.R.W. Patrick, gave a summary of the outrages that had occurred in April 1921. There was just one kidnapping. In the margin, there was a note indicating that the victim was Mrs. Noble Ardgroom and that the kidnapping took place in March 1921. 2 months on from the abduction, the RIC were still treating it as a kidnapping rather than a murder. After Bridget's disappearance, it was reported that her father was taken to the workhouse. It seems Bridget was his carer and there was nobody else to look after him. Bridget's husband, Alexander Noble, was working as a cooper in Grimsby, Lincolnshire at this stage, and he eventually found out that Bridget had disappeared. He was obviously anxious to find out what happened to her. But if your wife has been taken away by members of a secret underground organisation, who do you ask for information? On the 11th of July 1921, there was a truce in the War of Independence, and shortly afterwards, the Irish Republican leader Eamon de Valera travelled to London with an entourage for talks with British Prime Minister David Lloyd George. It was widely reported in the newspapers published on the 15th of July that de Valera had given a statement to the press the day before at the Grosvenor Hotel in London. This would have been a vital piece of information for Alexander. He now had the name of a senior Republican and an address where he could be contacted. Alexander immediately sent a letter to de Valera, care of the Grosvenor Hotel, inquiring about his wife's whereabouts. The letter reached de Valera at the Grosvenor even though he wasn't actually staying there. He replied to Alexander on the 18th of July, saying he would have inquiries carried out. De Valera was also being asked for information about the other missing woman, Mary Lindsay. In contrast with the secrecy surrounding the Noble case, the kidnapping of Mrs. Lindsay had received considerable publicity, thanks largely to her sister in Dublin, Mrs. Ethel Benson, who wrote letters to the newspapers. Lloyd George was reported to have asked de Valera about Mrs. Lindsay. The Republican leadership in Dublin fast-tracked inquiries into the Lindsay case, while it would take much longer for the fate of Mrs. Noble to be clarified. Unfortunately, there were no powerful statesmen inquiring into the fate of the woman from Reenavad. The weeks passed and Alexander heard nothing more. In September, he wrote again to de Valera, asking for the results of any inquiries that may have been carried out. The tone is respectful, but he cannot resist an embittered comment. It is not clean work to take away my lone defenceless wife. This letter seems to have sparked some action, for General Richard Mulcahy, Chief of Staff of the IRA, sent a request down the chain of command asking for information about the whereabouts of Bridget Noble. The request for information eventually reached Liam O'Dwyer, Commandant of the Beara Battalion, seen here on the left. He drew up a short report mentioned earlier, dated the 21st of October, stating that Mrs. Noble had been executed and explaining the reasons why she was put to death. He said the officers responsible for the execution were the staff of the battalion at that time. He said that the then battalion commandant was, of course, responsible for anything that happened in the battalion area. He did not say that he himself was the commandant, and I wondered if it was his predecessor who was responsible for the action taken against Mrs. Noble. It wasn't until O'Dwyer's military service pension file was released online a couple of years ago that one could confirm that O'Dwyer had taken over as commandant on the 8th of February 1921. So he was in charge when the bombing attack took place and when Mrs. Noble was disappeared. The vice commandant of the battalion was Micheál Óg O'Sullivan from the Adrigole area. He had a particular educational distinction. He had been a pupil of Pádraig Pearse at St. Enda's. He was a dedicated Gaeilgeoir and would later emigrate to America. One of the other staff officers was Daniel T. Sullivan, quartermaster of the battalion from the Irish area. Neither Daniel nor Micheál Óg were in Beara when the trial of Mrs. Noble took place, or when she was executed 2 days later. They had joined up to serve with Tom Barry's flying column and took part in the Cross-Barry ambush. There was still a delay in Alexander receiving word about Bridget's fate. After the truce, the IRA liaised with the British on observance of the truce. Alexander wrote to the local IRA liaison officer, probably Tom Barry, but failed to get a reply. He then employed the services of a well-known solicitor from Skibbereen, Jasper Travers Wolfe. Wolfe also tried to get answers through the IRA liaison system, but without success. The IRA's chief liaison officer, Emmett Dalton, advised that liaison staff could not take on the Noble case, as they were only authorised to deal with issues that occurred after the truce. In the meantime, with the aid of Jasper Wolfe, Alexander brought a case for compensation to court in Skibbereen in January 1922. Alexander gave evidence in court about his wife's disappearance, and the local newspaper report recorded that he wept bitterly. The RIC district inspector in charge of Castletownbere district, Thomas J. Oates, said he believed that Mrs. Noble was dead, as he had certain authority for saying so. Judge Hines said it was a most appalling case and awarded Alexander £1,500 in compensation. Jasper Wolfe continued with his efforts to clarify Mrs. Noble's fate and wrote to the new provisional government that took power in early 1922 following the treaty being signed. In March 1922, more than a year after Bridget's disappearance, Wolfe received a letter from the Secretary to the Minister for Defence, General Mulcahy, stating that Mrs. Noble had been executed for espionage. Alexander Noble did not return to live in Reenavad. He continued to reside in Grimsby for a period, and in March 1923 he marked the second anniversary of Bridget's death by inserting an in memoriam notice in his local newspaper in Fraserburgh. "In ever loving remembrance of my dear wife, Bridget Theresa Noble," he stated. He also included a quotation from Scripture: "Greater love than this hath no man, that one should lay down his life for another." It is unclear what he meant by this. Did he mean to convey that Bridget had put her own life on the line by inquiring with the Crown forces as to his whereabouts and welfare? One can only speculate. The following year, 1924, he emigrated to Australia, but didn't settle down, and returned to Britain. In 1927, at a registry office in Grimsby, he married a 39-year-old widow, Mabel Valens, but he was drinking heavily and there were soon problems in the marriage. It seems he suspected her of having an affair. He assaulted his wife and another man and was brought before Grimsby Sessions in January 1928. The court heard that his first wife had been murdered by Sinn Féiners, that he had received compensation and had been drinking ever since. The judge told him that the compensation had been his ruin. He got 6 months with hard labour. The marriage doesn't seem to have survived. Alexander returned to live in his native Fraserburgh, residing with an unmarried sister who suffered from Parkinson's disease, and his troubled life came to an end on the 26th of February 1941 in hospital in Aberdeen. He was aged 67 years. He was buried in Kirkton Cemetery, Fraserburgh. Returning to the issue of Bridget Noble and her fate, there are conflicting accounts locally as to how she was put to death. One school of thought believes that she was drowned, and one of the locations mentioned is this area in the northeast part of the townland of Ardgroom Inward. However, the above-mentioned Eva O'Sullivan, quoting her IRA contact, says Bridget was taken further along the coast by boat and brought in at Collerus, in the County Kerry part of Beara, where she was shot. Collerus is in the area of Lorach, and is noteworthy that Alexander states in his in memoriam notice that Bridget was shot at Lorach. Some locals point to an arch below what used to be a bridge at Collerus, where she is supposed to have been executed. On the tape, Eva says that the man who shot her was Patsy Dan Crowley. This is, of course, an allegation that cannot be confirmed. Patsy Dan Crowley himself had a tragic end. He was on the anti-treaty side in the Civil War and was badly beaten by Free State forces at the end of that conflict, and comrades have claimed that he sustained head injuries that would later cause his early death. He died in 1924 in hospital in Cork. Patsy Dan is buried here at Kilcatherine Graveyard, overlooking Coolock Bay. The grave lies within the ruins of the ancient church at this site. As regards the disposal of the remains of Mrs. Noble, there are two schools of thought locally. Some believe her remains ended up in Kenmare Bay, while others, such as Eva O'Sullivan, believe her remains were placed in a grave on land. After my book was published earlier this year, extra information emerged. I was put in touch with a man whose grandfather knew Mrs. Noble, and the story related by the grandfather was that Mrs. Noble's remains were thrown into Kenmare Bay, tied to a cartwheel, but the remains did not remain submerged and were caught in the nets of a fisherman from Kilmacalogue. He brought the remains ashore, and the IRA again dumped the remains at sea, only for them to be caught in the nets a second time. This time, the IRA decided to bury her remains on land. While this man doubtless gave an honest account of the story related by the grandfather, there is no way of independently confirming this version of events. Some believe that Mrs. Noble is buried here in Duras Woods in the Lorach area. In times past, when people were more likely to believe in ghost stories, there was a belief that the unquiet spirit of Bridget Noble haunted certain places in Lorach. There were reports of ghostly manifestations at Collerus and Duras Woods. A veil of secrecy was drawn over the killing of Bridget Noble. The fact that her remains were secretly disposed of meant that there was no inquest or military inquiry in lieu of an inquest. None of those involved made any public comment about the killing. Looking back on the saga of Bridget Noble, it is clear that no Republican died as a result of anything she did or was alleged to have done. The only person to die was Bridget herself, and she was put to death in violation of the IRA's own rules. I believe she lost her life mainly because she complained to the RIC about the men she accused of the bombing attack. It was ill-advised for her to do so in the circumstances of the time, but it could also be said that she showed great courage in standing up for her dignity as a woman. She paid the ultimate price. Bridget Noble has not been forgotten. Earlier this year, local people arranged for her to be remembered at Mass in her local church in Ardgroom on the centenary of her death. During the St. Patrick's Day Mass, Father Jerry Keane prayed in a special way for Bridget Noble, née O'Neill, late of Reenavad, Ardgroom, on her 100th anniversary. It is unlikely now that Bridget Noble's remains will ever be found, but wherever they lie, may she rest in peace. Thank you.